So today I will not be talking about sustainable agriculture at all, don't worry. I'm speaking more actually in the context of Earth observation, which has been my field of research over the last 4 years. And I've had an opportunity to speak to dozens of Earth observation experts, but of course, very few of you. Hopefully after this presentation, I can talk to more of you. But I would like to start actually with getting to know a little bit more about you. So maybe if you would like to scan this QR code or go to menti.com and enter this code. Don't worry, I won't be collecting any personal data. So I'm just going to change my screen here. Okay. Okay, so remote sensing, machine learning are coming out to be the top candidates. Interesting, okay. I'm going to move over to the next question. All right. Oh, we have one person with a background in ethics. I'm already encouraged. Is that me? Oh my God, okay. All right. So computer science is winning here. Current status, okay, PhD students. All right, great. Next. Now, these are where the questions get interesting for me. Okay. At least a lecture. This is improvement from the start from 4 years ago. All right, and then the last question here. Brilliant, thank you. This gives me a lot of tips on how to proceed with today's presentation. I think I made a good guess. So let's go ahead. So you might want to ask me first as to why on Earth do Earth observation scientists need to worry about ethics? And now with the AI Act, maybe even about the law. So there are a few answers I collected over the last 4 years, which I want to share with you. First is, of course, with increasing satellite image resolution, we have the issues of privacy, which everybody knows about, and I will not be talking about them today. Second, we have a lot of new use cases, and we have policy recommendations based on AI in EO research, which many of you are probably already involved with as well. And your answer to my survey, where you say that you wanted to go out into policy or the market, is also going in that direction. Of course, also we have several novel data sources, which are all coming together. And with each data source, there is a different set of ethical issues that comes into play. And now we see, of course, with my topic of presentation today, as well as what just happened a few days ago, the EU AI Act is no more a proposed act, it has become an actual act. So we all need to collectively look into ethics a little bit more closely now than we perhaps thought was necessary earlier. And finally, as we just saw, there is a lack of understanding about ethics amongst EO scientists, and of course also vice versa. When I got into this field, I spent quite a lot of time trying to understand what in the world the EO scientists are actually doing. So this was a very interesting experience for me, and it was also very interesting for me to see that most of the EO scientists have never thought about ethics or even studied it formally at all. So I want to ask you here to keep it a little bit more informal and interactive. What, according to you, is ethics? Please, you can raise your hand and just answer. No idea? Yes?
Finding a justified explanation for our actions.
Okay, justifying your actions? Something more basic? Ethics is essentially the distinction between what we should not do and what we should do, right? So ethics always has two sides. One, so let me take a step back. So ethics, to understand what we should and should not do, creates guidelines. And one golden rule for ethics is don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. And if this is a little too abstract, then some of the more precise guidelines for ethics are honesty, integrity, and fairness, the three basic principles of ethics. Now, that is still kind of abstract, so we'll make it more precise for you as we go ahead. But the next thing that we need to know is that when we talk about an ethical issue, we're talking about an ethical risk and side-by-side an ethical opportunity. So ethics comes into play not when everything is crystal clear white, because if everything is crystal clear white and right, just do it. And if everything is not at all clear and is totally black and unknown, don't do it, right? So ethics comes into play when we are in that gray area, where there are some ethical risks, but there's also an ethical opportunity. And here what we see, therefore, is that when we go to an extreme of an ethical issue, what we reach is what's known as an ethical dilemma. So what is an ethical dilemma? An ethical dilemma is essentially like a paradox where either of the options that you choose will reach a solution that is not really desirable. Can anybody give me an example of an ethical dilemma? A very famous one. The trolley dilemma, exactly. So where would you swerve? To the left or to the right? So I don't know if you guys have seen a recent Nature paper, it's actually not very recent anymore, called the Moral Machine Experiment, where they interviewed 40 million people in more than 150 countries and asked them a bunch of ethics questions on their intuition of ethics, and divided these countries into three groups: the North, or let's say the East, the West, and the South, and asked them on their couches while they were sitting comfortably that if they were faced with a trolley dilemma and had to swerve their car to the right and kill an elderly person, or swerve to the left and kill a child, who would they kill, or who would they save, as you might like to frame it? Which one would you choose? How many would choose the child to save? The child. How many would choose the elderly to save? So this actually is called ethical relativism, because what they found in their paper was that most people in the western part and the southern part of the world would choose to save the child, but in the eastern part of the world, there was a proclivity to save the elderly. So all of you who chose to save the child, I want to also ask you, what if the elderly person was your grandmom? So you can see that ethics, when you try to codify ethics based on statistics or data, it can lead to a lot of problems, right? Because the Moral Machine Experiment tried to do exactly that. Based on its 40 million responses, it recommends that in the western part of the world, code all of the autonomous vehicles to save the child, and in the eastern part of the world, code all the autonomous vehicles to save the elderly. Now, these policy decisions are extremely problematic from an ethics and even from a human rights perspective. Now, I want to take it a little bit closer to home for you guys. Let's look at this particular scenario, which has actually been floating around on Facebook. Imagine that you're driving past a bus stop, and there's a large storm coming up. and you know that the bus that's coming is a little delayed. And you see on the bus stop 3 people. The first person is an elderly woman who very, very quickly needs to be driven to the hospital to save her life. The second is an ancient best friend of yours who once saved your life. And the third is the love of your life who you've been really waiting for an opportunity to talk to. Now, you are, by the way, driving a convertible. You get to choose to save one person, I guess, if you have a convertible. Who would you choose to save? Your best friend? Your best friend because he or she said. You can choose, by the way, who's your best friend and who's the love of your life. Right, so some of you say best friend, you all agree? How many would, okay, let's do a show of hands. How many would save the elderly woman who's dying? Okay, how many would save your best friend? Okay, we see a majority here. And how many would choose to save the love of your life or maybe get a few minutes of chatting time with her or him? Whoa, this is the first. Actually, it's very interesting that these 3 figures actually are imageries for what we call the triple bottom line. The elderly woman is essentially like our Earth that is dying and needs urgent attention. The best friend is like our friends and colleagues who need definitely attention as well, the people who we're with, and then, of course, the love of our lives, especially when we're in business, and that is profits. Would you change your answer now? No? All right, that's very interesting. Now, going forward with ethical relativism, these are 2 posters I took photos of while I was visiting LA last year for the IGARS conference. It says here, in case it's not clear, it says, clear customs faster than you can say cheese, introducing biometric facial comparison. So we're in Europe. How many of you are perfectly comfortable with biometric facial comparison happening in public anytime? Show of hands. Okay. Interestingly, in the AI Act, the biometric facial comparison is categorized as a high-risk AI. It is not outlawed, though. There are certain circumstances in which it is permitted, including, for example, in law enforcement. Now, what's very interesting for me in AI is that it is very similar to economics. I don't know if you guys have heard of Elinor Ostrom. She was a Nobel-winning, she was actually not an economist. She was a political scientist, but she got a Nobel Prize in economics. And this statement from her very famous book actually applies, in my opinion, equally to AI. She says, what makes these models, whether it be AI or economic models, so interesting and so powerful is that they capture important aspects of many different problems that occur in diverse settings in all parts of the world. Think of the trolley dilemma problem with the moral machine experiment. Now, what makes these models so dangerous is that when they are used as a foundation for policy making, they overlook constraints that were fixed in the model, but in empirical settings, they are no more fixed. And this leads to a lot of problems when we are trying to convert AI-based models into policy. And that is where ethics becomes extremely important. Let's come closer to home, to Earth observation. This is a slum. I want to ask you, is the understanding of a person in LA about what is a slum the same as the understanding of a person, say, in New Delhi? No, right? So here already we see that what's happening now, several of the people who are working in slum mapping have told me that what they're trying to do through AI and Earth observation is that they take data from those parts of the world where data is readily available in high quantities, train models, and these models are supposed to predict what is happening in regions of the world which are not so data-rich. And here again, we see the issue of ethical relativism. When you're using data from where it's available to predict things from other regions of the world, you have to take into account several ethical concerns. Now, here, let's go deeper into the Earth Observation Unit. This is an excerpt from Annex 3 of the EU AI Act. This says, in Annex 3 are listed all of the AI systems which will be categorized as high risk, no matter what. Do you see any of your Earth observation or remote sensing work falling into this? I know, for example, disaster management. You'll see here, when you're doing any AI-related work where you are going to create a recommender system, which allows policymakers to decide how to allocate scarce resources, you are within the purview of the AI Act. Sorry? C, yeah, used to dispatch or establish priority in the dispatching of emergency. This is one thing, yeah. But any scarce resources, for example, Earth observation is now being used to help policymakers decide which areas to prioritize for electrification. Again, you are under A, eligibility of natural persons for essential public assistance, benefits, or services. You're allocating scarce resources using AI. You are within the purview of a high-risk AI system. So you need to comply with the Act. Going further, it was very fascinating for me to see how different approaches to ethical decision-making are now being codified in the AI Act. So in the Western world, where we are right now, a couple of very dominant approaches to ethics are essentially what we call duty-based approaches, which ask essentially questions such as, what are my duties? Have I followed my duties? The second approach is the so-called consequence-based approach or teleological approach, which asks, what are the likely consequences of my actions? And then, of course, there are combined approaches. Now here, it's very interesting that under the AI Act, you will see several provisions which talk about potential extent of harm, which is essentially another way of talking about potential consequences of the system. So you see the consequentialist approach is taken very seriously in the AI Act. However, there is a problem here when we are talking about emerging technologies, including actually AI, because often we have no idea what the consequence of our actions is going to be until very much later. Can you guess who this is? Who is it? So the students from Duke University who created this and put it out into the marketplace, they were surprised to see that when this picture was uploaded, this is what resulted. What went wrong here? The training data was biased, wasn't it? How might this apply to your field of work? If we go back to the slum example, for instance. So bias in training data can lead to several unethical consequences, which we need to really be mindful of. So I went further from Western approaches to my side of the world to see Eastern approaches to ethical decision-making. And one of the very common ways for deciding on ethics in the Eastern part of the world is through the concept of karma. Anybody heard that? So karma is a very interesting concept. No? Karma loosely translates as action. But interestingly, it not only includes actions, but also the causes of the action, as well as the consequences of the actions. And most interestingly, the intention which drives an action is also karma, right? Now, based on karma, you combine karma with the concept of what is known as duties, what we saw previously also in the Western approaches, to decide whether an action is ethical or not. So in Eastern approaches to ethical decision-making, we see the coming together of what I saw as, what I said as intention of a person, the duty of the person, and, of course, the consequences. Now here again, we're back to duties and consequences, both of which are a little bit obscure, unsure, when we're talking about something as new as AI, or even newer as AI4EO in many instances. So I started digging a little further to find out, okay, what else is there in the Eastern part of the world when it comes to ethical decision-making? And I came across this very interesting mythological figure, which shows up in Indian as well as Tibetan and Japanese mythology, and his name is Skanda. Now, Skanda in India is also the brother of the elephant god. But while the elephant god takes care of the spiritual realms, Skanda, his brother, takes care of the very material, very practical realms of our existence. And in Indian art and mythology, you see Skanda always depicted with two goddesses, named Valli on the green side and Devsena. Now, interestingly, this imagery is very telling, because while Skanda is the symbol of knowledge and wisdom, he cannot go without Valli, which is intention, and action, which is Devsena. Because knowledge alone doesn't help us unless it is combined with the right intention and the action which executes that knowledge. These three together actually constitute what we call our three powers, which is a very interesting talk by Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, who's a philosopher from India who's very renowned for his knowledge of Vedic wisdom. And in his very interesting talk, he speaks about this imagery of Skanda and elaborates on our three powers, which are very much present in the present, which are intention, action, and knowledge. Now, what we see here is the intention aspect is super relevant under the AI Act. So while the word consequences shows up only 7 times in the AI Act, the words intended purpose showed up 37 times in the draft act and 50 times in the final act as passed. And the intention behind any AI systems formulates the foundation for determining everything, starting from whether it's a high-risk system, how to organize the risk management, how to do the data governance, how to do the record keeping, the transparency provisions, the human oversight requirements, and so on and so forth. The fundamental basis and the first question asked is, what is the intended purpose of the system? And with this, actually, it's very interesting that when we talk about data and what kind of data needs to be given up to the government or to the authorities under the Act, to determine that also, the first question that will be asked is, what is the intended purpose of your system? Now, for example, here, if we look at the quality control system under the Act, it says that systems and procedures for data management, including data acquisition, data collection, data analysis, data everything, essentially have to be provided when we are talking about any high-risk AI system. And as we saw from Annex 3, quite a lot of the EO work does fall under high-risk category. Now here, there is kind of like a silver lining, which says that you can avoid the entire provisions relating to disclosure of data and all the high-risk, all of the problems associated with dealing with a high-risk system, provided that the AI system has been trained and tested on data reflecting the specific geographical, behavioral, contextual, or functional setting within which they are intended, again, to be used. So here it's very interesting that if your training data has limitations, it's limited to a certain geography, and you disclose that very openly as a limitation of your whole system, you are saved from being labeled as a high-risk system. And this is actually the fair and honest thing to do in any AI system, because if we go back to Elinor Ostrom's quote, we need to understand that AI models have their limitations, just like any economic model does. And using them in policy decisions is a double-edged sword. So coming back to the trolley dilemma, if we look at intentions rather than duties and consequences, how can we completely avoid the trolley dilemma? Can we create infrastructure such that the trolley dilemma doesn't arise at all? So that there are no pedestrians that come in front of an autonomous vehicle, we can create pedestrian highways. Coming to our friends here, any suggestions on how we can achieve all three, how we can save all three, or get all three? Yes? Yes, the big hand. Very good, exactly. You didn't hear that? Okay, yes. The answer is simply that give your best friend your car keys, tell him or her to drive the elderly woman to the hospital, and you spend some time on the bus stop with the love of your life. You create a win-win for everybody. And here we notice that what I would like to end with is I was very inspired by your talk, Professor Saleh, in the morning, where you spoke about going from the I to the pi so that we have a second leg of expertise. And I would add that there needs actually also to be a third leg, which is of ethics, so that we can really have a sustainable future for AI and AI for Earth observation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Yep.
Hey, thank you for a nice talk. I wanted to ask, it might seem a stupid question, but how does the Act define an AI system? Because I can fall back to classical systems like for computer vision people, Euler-Jones detector 2000. So they were much before deep learning came into the picture and face recognition was still done.
Yeah.
So those do systems where you understand completely what's happening, do they fall under this? Because you can still have smaller systems, locally trained, deployed, so according to conformity, then it's okay, right? So how does the Act actually define an AI system?
So actually, I must say I didn't memorize the definition. There is a definition for AI systems, but what I can answer your question as is that it doesn't regulate every AI system. As I said, if it is geographically limited, if it has a specific scope, it is small scale, then it is categorized under lower levels of risk. And then it is not so heavily regulated. I hope that somewhat answers your question. But I can definitely give you a copy of the Act and you can see the definition there as well.
Okay, any other question? Yeah?
Thank you for your presentation. And in your presentation, we talked. You talked a lot about the intended things. You know, the intention. What is your intention? But then, sometime when you are working, how do you deal with the unintended consequences as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So unintended consequences, you know, ethics has its scope, and what I love to always say is that scientists have the freedom to make mistakes, provided they are legitimate mistakes. And you have done everything in your power to really look into your own self and see why are you building the system? What are its limitations? What might go wrong, right? Now, if you've taken all your precautions, and despite that something goes wrong, you are at least not on the wrong side of ethics. Yeah? So unintended consequences, ethics does not cover that. Yeah? The law also will do its best to minimize that kind of circumstance, but the fact is that human beings make mistakes, right? But what can we do to really put a bridge around and be honest about what are the limitations of our systems? And for that, we have to take responsibility.
Okay, and then we have a question here.
Thank you. We talk a lot about things like, you know, data standards, interoperability of systems, but I think less of focus is put on finding agreement among ethics across regions. I mean, the EU Act managed to somehow find a consensus among the member states, but does that limit in some ways the opportunity to do interregional projects with partners who maybe have other ethical guidelines? Like, how do we sort of bridge that gap to make sure that everybody can still work together on projects?
That's a very good question, ethical relativism, as we were talking about. Yeah, you know, here, the fundamental principles, if we see, of ethics, as I started with, no, the golden rule, don't do to others what you wouldn't want others to do to you, or honesty, integrity, and fairness. These are principles that are universal. Now, of course, the issue comes up because even these universal principles might be applied in different ways in different contexts. And this is different not only from region to region, you know, as we see from the biometric identification system, even in the Western world, we have differences in standards or understandings of what is ethical and what is not. So here, then, we have to really see about the sensitivities of the people, because ethics is about people. Ethics is very concrete. So you have to deploy a system based on the sensitivities of the region where you're deploying it, because otherwise you're anyway not going to sell anything, right? So this is but of course the basic minimum standards, and I would say if there is a high standard that can be made applicable across the globe without negatively affecting innovation, then that is the way to go, rather than a lower standard which then will just create strife.
Okay, any more questions? Then, oh yeah.
So, I'm interested to know about your thoughts about how these like regulations are affecting innovation, and if you have any thoughts about that, particularly AI, like is every time you see a new model innovation, so to what extent this is impacting that? Thank you.
That's the million-dollar question. We will see how it rolls out. Of course, I'm already hearing several unhappy statements from various quarters. For example, one thing that I've been really seeing as an important issue is how to bridge the conversation between pure science people or engineers and people who are working in social sciences like ethics or even law. Because they speak different languages. Like as a lawyer by training, we like to use the word as best as possible. So for example, in the AI Act, it says that data sets have to be as far as possible free of error. Now, as a lawyer, I will tell you that as far as possible often has many, many, many different meanings depending on the context. So for a scientist, I've spoken to EO scientists and say, a data set that is free of error, I've never heard of such a thing, right? So bridging the language between different disciplines is one of the key elements that is going to see the success of the act or its failure. And of course, standardization work that you guys are already planning will hopefully help in bridging that. But I also suspect that it's going to be really a learning by doing. And I feel that we're going to see a lot of either amendments to the law or several delegated little regulations coming into play to make the act actually workable over the coming couple of decades. But I don't think all issues are resolved at this moment. I think they're pretty much just starting.